of Christ. Glad to be back with you with part 2 of this spirit-led teaching. Knowing the difference between possession and ownership. Ephesians 6:12 says that we war not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world. The rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. So the enemy, which presents himself to the world and the church world as Christ, which he's really Antichrist, seeks to keep us in spiritual darkness. His aim is to keep you out of purpose in order to trap you in his plan. Okay, understand this. The false Christ aim, which presents himself to the world and the church world as the true Christ, but he's the false Christ, is to keep you out of purpose so he can keep you trapped in his plan. God is purpose, the devil has a plan, so be careful. Be very careful not to get trapped in the plans of the wicked one. So we have to know the difference between possession and prosperity. He don't want us to know the difference between possession and prosperity. Prosperity is ownership. Prosperity is not of the flesh. Ownership is not of the flesh. Ownership is of the spirit. And once you're in your eternal state of ownership, you own him, because anything you have authority over, you own. Authority is ownership. So when you got authority over the wicked one, guess what? You own the wicked one. This is why he fights to keep you out of ownership. This is why he fights to keep you out of purpose and trap you in his plan. Where you chasing dreams in the world that's going to just, in a moment's time, poof, go up in smoke. We need an eternal reality check. An eternal reality check. So we war not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places, which try to block us from that position of ownership, because once you're back in ownership, you're back in authority. Once you're back in ownership, you're back in authority. What you have authority over, you own. Don't you know Christ owns Satan? He owns him. He owns him. And because he owns him, he's already judged him to death. So the end result of all sin is death. This is why he fights to keep you out of ownership. Because ownership, it supersedes the material things which we possess. It supersedes it. Those things are corruptible. Ownership is not corruptible. Ownership is authority. What you have authority over is what you own. And Christ has authority over Satan. Light has authority over darkness. Let us go to Ephesians 5:8-17. Ephesians 5:8-17. 8 says, "For you were sometimes darkness, but now are you light in the Lord. Walk as the children of light." That's speaking to us, that we are to walk as the children of light, meaning we are to walk in the mind of Christ. What is the very first thing that the Lord said in the beginning of Genesis? Be fruitful and multiply. Well, who was he speaking to? He was speaking to the spiritual man and woman. Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, take dominion, that's authority, over it. Because we were operating in the spirit of ownership. What you have authority over, you own. When we fell from our place of authority, we fell from ownership. When we fell from ownership, we fell to a place of sin. That is total spiritual depravity. Now, all we could pursue was the things of the world. We couldn't be fruitful no longer, because we were fallen spiritual men and women that were now sin tainted and limited to the flesh. So all we pursued was the things of the flesh, and defined our walk with God. The false god of this world, according to what we wore, what we drove, the type of house we lived in, these type of things. And these type of things are corruption. They do not represent your walk with the uncorruptible God. What represents our walk with God the Father through Christ is the fruit of Christ. This is why we ought to be fruitful and multiply. This is why in the end he says in Matthew 6:33, he says, seek first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you, the financial and material things of the world. You see, once you're back into a place of ownership, you're back into a place of multiplication, where you're multiplying as spiritual men and women. Once we begin to multiply in the spirit, and the flesh comes under the government of the multiplication of the spirit, he's going to once again in divine order add to us the financial and material provision of the spirit. Because procreation, which is flesh, follows our multiplication as a new creation, which is spirit. We have to separate these two things, and these things have to be taught. They have to be taught. Nine says, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. The fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Be fruitful and multiply. Is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. 10. Proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. Discerning what is acceptable unto the Lord, because it discerns between the flesh and the spirit. It discerns whether you're in a position of ownership, or you in poverty possessing what you do not lawfully own. Possession outside of ownership is poverty. That's poverty. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Reprove the works of darkness, but don't have any fellowship with it. And if people get offended, because people like to do their religious talk, but the minute you bring light into that religious darkness, all of a sudden they got an issue with it. Well, if they don't want your light, then they need to keep their darkness to themselves. But have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove it. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. 13, but all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light, for whatsoever does make manifest is light. Light will manifest darkness, because light owns darkness. Now, light did not create darkness. Satan was not created evil. He was created good. But iniquity was found in him when he didn't want to be like Christ. He wanted to be Christ. And that's sin. He didn't want to be like Christ, which is to be like God. He wanted to be Christ, which is to say he wanted to be God. And in that corruption, iniquity was found in him, and he fell from the grace of God. He got the boot and became his own God. So in that fallen state, when he takes financial and material in the mindset of poverty that we have in him, and what he deceives us into thinking is wealth, with that mindset of poverty, that's a deadly combination. Because what ends up being created is a high-minded monster. A high-minded monster. 14, wherefore he said, awake. 14, wherefore he said, awake, you that are asleep, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. Those that are asleep in religion, Bible-based religion, Judeo-religion, and every other dead religion, arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. Who's going to give you light? Christ shall give you light. Did it say the Bible was going to give you light? No, there's no light in the Bible. Christ will give you light. He's the light of the letter. Did it say someone in a religious office was going to give you light? No, Christ is going to give you light. And don't let anyone, including any religious leader in a pastoral office, give you the letter as a substitute for light. "15 says, see then that we walk circumspectly. See then that we walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise." Listen to this, 16. "Redeeming the time. Redeeming the time, because the days are evil." Redeeming the time. How is the time redeemed? See, long as we're in these physical bodies, the time has to be redeemed. When your spirit is born of the Spirit, Christ through your transformed spirit comes to the soul and the body by the fruit of the Spirit. Now, the flesh is under the government of the eternal purpose of the Spirit. Now the time is being redeemed, because only Christ can redeem the time. Outside of that, your unborn again spirit is in sin. And death through your unborn again spirit within, through the fruit of death without, is causing your flesh to pass away with time. You're passing away with time. So you're either passing away with time according to the fruit of death, or you're being redeemed with time according to the fruit of life. You have to know where you are. You can't just be passing away in church. Because how we spent our time here is going to be judged. It's going to be judged. Was it in purpose? Was it in purpose where you were being fruitful and multiplying? Or was it in Satan's plan where you were just passing away? You were trapped in his plan and just passing away with time. "17, as we come to a close, says, wherefore be not unwise, but understanding." That means you have to have the spiritual understanding. You have to have the key to Scripture. "Wherefore be not unwise, spiritually ignorant, but understanding in spiritual light what the will of God is." What the will of God is. What the will of God is. His will was in the letter. His will was for you to be in his purpose. In his purpose, which is Christ. In his purpose, which is Christ. And this brings us to a conclusion of part 2 of this teaching. This brings us to a conclusion of part 2 of this teaching. Love you with the love of Christ, and I'll be back with you in part 3.